One of the broadcast talks, one of the theological virtues which Lewis looked at was hope. Faith, hope, and love, and he's really looking at these in opposite order, the charity or love, hope, and then faith. And under hope, he says this means that a continual looking forward to the eternal world is not, as some modern people think, a form of escapism or wishful thinking, but one of the things a Christian is meant to do. It does not mean that we are to leave the present world as it is. It is, since Christians have largely ceased to think of the other world, that they have become so ineffective in this. Aim at heaven and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you will get neither. Most of us find it very difficult to want heaven at all. One reason for this difficulty is that we have not been trained. Our whole education tends to fix our minds on this world. Another reason is that when the real want for heaven is present with us, we do not recognize it. This is a great theme of Lewis that he plays out in other areas as well. We don't recognize these indicators that are pointing us to heaven. Most people, if they had really learned to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want, and want acutely, something that cannot be had in this world. There are all sorts of things in this world that offer to give it to you, but they never quite keep their promise. There was something we grasped at in that first moment of longing which just fades away in the reality. I think everyone knows what I mean. The wife may be a good wife or husband. The hotels and scenery may have been excellent. And chemistry may be a very interesting job, but something has evaded us. And there are now two wrong ways of dealing with this fact, and one right way in terms of dealing with these longings that we just really can't define. But they point us, and we're constantly trying to find ways of satisfying them. You know, if I can just get to Disney World as a kid, I'll be born again. But it just never does the job. The fool's way is to blame other people for the fact that things haven't played out the way they ought to. Another way is the disillusioned or sensible man. And you can read those, but the one I want to look at here is the Christian way. The way of understanding and putting together these longings. The Christian says creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. Say it again. Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. And we believe this because we believe God made us for purpose. And all the things He made were made for a purpose. They're not there just randomly. And if we have desires, then those desires should be linked to things that satisfy those desires. Example, a baby feels hungry. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there's such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy this one, but only to arouse it, to awaken it, to suggest the real thing. And if that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, but on the other hand, never to mistake them for the something else of which they are only a copy, an echo, a mirage. And that is what we constantly do. We put our faith in temporal things when the longing really is longing for something eternal. And so we're always disappointed. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of my life to press on to that other country and to help others to do the same. Let me give you an example. One of my dear friends, Jim Harrell, just died, went to be with the Lord January 8th. He had Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. Most people who are diagnosed die within the first year or two. 6 years. He was one of those unusual ones. And it's really quite wonderful on the front end because you have some extra time. On the backside, it's terrible. And for the last 2 years of his life, he basically could just maybe from bed to a particular kind of chair. Everything had to be done for him. Everything. And the last part of his last couple of months, it was very difficult to even understand him. Part of what got him through this and made him so incredibly effective in those last 6 years of his life, I mean, powerfully effective with people in a way that his life never was before, is because all of a sudden eternity, heaven, became a real thing. And it made him extremely effective here. And it became real to him. And one way that it became real was actually something I did. We were together about 3 years ago. And we were talking about heaven, and all of a sudden I said, Jim, I said, write this name down, Jerry Harden. He said, why? He says, because he's a friend of mine, he's in heaven, I want you to meet him. He said, I can't take a piece of paper with me. I said, well, that's not the point, Jim. I said, if you don't write this name down, you'll forget him, because I'm serious. I want you to meet this guy because I have a message I want you to give to him. He says, I can't believe you're telling me this. I said, well, Jim, stop a moment and just think about it. Unless something happens unexpectedly to me, the chances are you'll get there before me, right? He says, yes. And you believe me when I say Jerry Harden is in this place. We have that faith and understanding. He says, well, yeah. Well, if you're both there, it seems to stand to reason that you can meet one another, right? He says, well, yeah, I just never thought about it. He says, good, write this name down. Because this is what I want you to tell him. This fellow's name is Jerry Harden, one of my dearest friends from Oregon. He died about 15 to 20 years ago. And Jerry knows I'm about the only one cheeky enough to do this. I said, I want you to go up to him. I want to say, Jerry, I'm Jim Harrell. We have a mutual friend, Chris Mitchell. And he wants to tell you that he loves you. He misses you. He can't wait to see you. He wants to know that Carol, his wife, is doing well. Your children are walking in the Lord, and you're a grandpa. Now, Jerry may know that. I don't know. But Jim's doing it. He maybe has already done it. And it's that sense of beginning to open up and realize that this isn't the only show, folks. And that's what Lewis is trying to say here. And that it is so easy for the spell of the world to just get us looking down and rendering impotent all these other virtues, these things that we ought to be about. Now, in order to do this, it takes faith. And the last two broadcast talks in this series had to do with faith. And I can't spend a lot of time here. And he looks at faith from two different perspectives. Two levels, as he calls it. The first one is just simply belief, accepting or regarding as true the doctrines of Christianity. That is fairly simple, this idea. And I'm going to move on to the next sense. And he gets to it at the end of this chapter, chapter 11 in the book. And he says, now I must turn to faith in the second or higher sense. You may remember I said that the first step toward humility was to realize that one is proud. I want to add now the next step is to make some serious attempt to practice Christian virtues. A week is not enough. Things often go swimmingly for a week. Try 6 weeks. By that time, one will have discovered some truths about oneself. No person knows how bad they are till they have tried to be very good. Only those who try to resist temptation know how strong it is. After all, you find out the strength of the wind by trying to walk against it, not by lying down. A person who gives in to temptation after 5 minutes simply does not know what it would have been like after an hour. That is why bad people, in one sense, know very little about badness. They have lived a sheltered life by always giving in. We never find out the strength of an evil impulse inside us until we try to fight it. And Christ, because he was the only man who never yielded to temptation, is also the only man who knows the full weight of that temptation, which we spoke about last night. Jesus was the only complete realist. Very well then, if there was any idea that God had set us a sort of exam that we might get good marks by deserving them, that has been wiped out. That is not Christianity. If there was any idea of a sort of bargain, any idea that we could perform our side of the contract and thus put God in our debt so that it was up to him in mere justice to perform his side, that has to be wiped out. In other words, what Lewis is saying is when you try to be good, you realize how far short you fall. And you realize there's no bargaining here. You have no bargaining chip. So is this case hopeless? No. When they find it blown to bits, some people think this means that Christianity is a failure and give up. One of the very things Christianity was designed to do was to blow this idea to bits. That you can't do it by yourself. God has been waiting for that moment at which you discover that there is no question of earning a passing mark in this exam or putting him in your debt. When they find it blown to bits, Christianity begins to speak. When a man has made these two discoveries, God can really get to work. It is after this that real life begins. The person is awake now. We can now go on to talk of faith in the second sense. And he begins this by taking us further into this second sense. He says there are certain things in Christianity that can be understood from the outside, looking in. But there are a great many things that cannot be understood until after you've gone a certain distance along the Christian road. These things are purely practical, though they do not look as if they were. They are directions for dealing with particular crossroads and obstacles on the journey, and they do not make sense until a person has reached those places. He says, I'm trying to talk about faith in the second sense, the higher sense. In other words, once one discovers their bankruptcy, that's what he's talking about. Now, once again, what God cares about is not actually our actions. He really cares about us coming to this point of bankruptcy, so which now we open ourselves up. Not to ourselves, but to God. What he cares about is that we should be creatures of a certain kind of quality, the kind of creatures he intended us to be, creatures related to himself in a certain way. I do not add and related to one another in a certain way, because that is included. If you are right with him, you will inevitably be right with your fellow creatures. And as long as a man is thinking of God as an examiner, who would set him a sort of paper to do, or as the opposite party in a sort of a bargain, as long as he's thinking of claims and counterclaims between himself and God, he is not yet in the right relation to him. He is misunderstanding what he is and what God is. And he cannot get into the right relation until he has discovered the fact of his bankruptcy. And he really means discover, experientially discovering this fact. He begins to talk in this area about the goal of our faith, not this bargain, but is really directing us to share in what he calls sonship. The sonship of Christ with God. To make us like himself, actually sons of God. And he says he's going to analyze this more in the next book, which he does. But he says if you like to put it in that way, Christ offers something for nothing. He even offers everything for nothing. In a sense, the whole Christian life consists in accepting that very remarkable offer. But the difficulty is to reach the point of recognizing that all that we have done and can do is nothing. And in yet another sense, handing everything over to Christ does not, of course, mean that you stop trying. There's a tension here. And yet another sense, to trust him means, of course, trying to do all that he says. There would be no sense in saying you trusted a person if you would not take his advice. Thus, if you have really handed yourself over to him, it must follow that you are trying to obey him. but trying in a new way, a less worried way. Not doing these things in order to be saved, but because He has begun to save you already. Not hoping to get to heaven as a reward of your actions, but inevitably wanting to act in a certain way because the first gleam of heaven is already inside of you. Christians have often disputed as to whether what leads the Christian home is good actions or faith in Christ. And note, he leads us to Philippians chapter 2. The Bible really seems to clinch the matter when he puts the two things together in one amazing sentence. The first half is, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, which looks as if everything depended on us and our good actions. But the second half goes on, for it is God who worketh in you, which looks as if God did everything and we nothing. I'm afraid that is the sort of thing we come up against in Christianity. And I'm puzzled, Lewis says, but I'm not surprised. You see, we are now trying to understand and to separate into watertight compartments what exactly God does and what man does when God and man are working together. And you can't really do that. And of course, we begin by thinking it is like two men working together so that you would say, he did this bit and I did that. But this way of thinking breaks down. God is not like that. He is inside you as well as outside. Even if we could understand who did what, I do not think human language could properly express it. And here he's talking about the indwelling presence of God in the believer, the Spirit that works in tandem. And he finishes, I think all Christians would agree with me if I said that though Christianity seems at first to be all about morality, all about duties and rules and guilt and virtue, yet it leads you on as you progress in the journey out of all of that into something beyond. And that has everything to do with relationship, with growing in that relationship of understanding. It's like the beginning of a friendship. I have a friend for 30 years, Dave Johnson. We've gone way beyond some of those early stages, and we've gotten to the beyond. We share things, I share things with him and he with me that I can't even express in many ways. And I don't with any other male friend. Something beyond. One has a glimpse of a country where they do not talk of those things except perhaps as joke. Everyone there is filled full with what we should call goodness, as a mirror is filled with light. But they do not call it goodness. They do not call it anything. They are too busy looking at the source from which it comes. But this is near the stage where the road passes over the rim of our world. No one's eyes can see very far beyond that. Lots of people's eyes can see further than mine. And that is where this trajectory of life is going. And that ends that set of broadcast talks. The last set is in some ways, I think, almost the most important, at least in parts of it. It's called Beyond Personality, the first steps in the doctrine of the Trinity. And this is, if you could look at these lectures, these talks, in the book Mere Christianity, there are two bookends. The first bookend is Lewis saying, okay, if I'm going to talk about Christianity to people in a way that at least they're going to understand it. They may not accept it, but they'll understand it. I first need to get them to a place where they understand that there's a reason for guilt, a reason for feeling like we've failed and that we need some help outside of the material world. That was that first set of broadcast talks. And then he moved us to what are the basic essence of what we believe, and then looking at what Christian life looks like from the inside, Christian morality. Now he's going to take a step, and he began this whole series this way. Everyone has warned me not to tell you what I'm going to tell you in this last book. They say the ordinary reader does not want theology. Give him plain, practical religion. I've rejected their advice. I do not think the ordinary reader is such a fool. Theology means the science of God. And I think any man who wants to think about God at all would like to have the clearest and most accurate ideas about Him which are available. You are not children. Why should you be treated like children? Now just try to picture yourself in some pub, some base for the RAF or whatever, and hearing a guy over the radio saying this to you. That's what's going on. By the way, I should add that it's been said that during the war years, Lewis was the most familiar voice to the people of Great Britain, second only to Winston Churchill. That was how pervasive these broadcast talks were. He begins this by talking about theology, and he likens it to a map. And again, you can read that. And that this theology is really practical. Now he gets down to this idea of, as he begins to move into really looking at the Trinity and the practical implications for the Trinity for the Christian life. And one of the things that is significant about this section for us as believers, the way Lewis treats it, is the Trinity for him is not a problem. It is a source in which we begin to understand and can put together everything else. It really leads to a solution. But throughout the history of the church, we've made it so often just a problem. And that's not it. It has extreme practical importance. A little bit into this chapter, he reads the paragraph, but as soon as you look at any real Christian writings, you find that they are talking about something quite different from popular religion. They say that Christ is the Son of God, whatever that means. They say that those who give him their confidence can also become sons of God, whatever that means. And they say that his death saved us from our sins, whatever that means. There is no good complaining that these statements are difficult. Christianity claims to be telling us about another world, about something behind the world we can touch and hear and see. You may think the claim false, but if it were true, what it tells us would be bound to be difficult, at least as difficult as modern physics, and for the same reason. Now, the point in Christianity which gives us the greatest shock is the statement that by attaching ourselves to Christ, we can become sons of God, children of God, daughters of God, however you want to put it. One asks, aren't we sons of God already? Surely the fatherhood of God is one of the main ideas of Christian ideas. Yes, in the sense that he created all things and we're related in that way to him. But when the Bible talks about becoming sons of God, obviously it means something different. And that brings us up against the very center of theology. And that center is the Trinity. Because the idea of becoming a son of God, a child of God, is related to the Son of God. And to understand what it means for us to be a son of God, we must begin by understanding who the Son of God was. One of the creeds says that Christ is the Son of God, begotten, not created. And it adds, begotten by his Father before all worlds. We are now thinking not about the virgin birth. We are thinking about something that happened before nature, before all things was created, before time began, before all worlds. Christ was begotten, not created. What does that mean? Now remember last night I talked about the idea of the church having to give an account of itself. And its praxis means that they're dealing with a God that is manifested and is three persons. I mean, three different persons, one God. How do you do this? How do you explain it? And they came up with this language drawing upon John chapter 1 and Psalm 2 and other places, that the Son is begotten, not made. Those are the terms. We don't use the words begetting or begotten much in modern English, but everyone still knows what they mean. To beget is to become the father of. To create is to make. And the difference is this: when you beget something of the same kind as yourself. A man begets human babies. A beaver begets little beavers. And a bird begets eggs, which turn into little birds. But what you make something of a different kind from yourself. Birds make nests. Beavers build dams. A man makes a wireless set. Or he may make something more like himself than a wireless set, say a statue. And if he's clever enough, carver, he may make a statue which is very like a man indeed, but of course it is not a real man, it only looks like one. It cannot breathe or think. It is not alive. Now, that is the first thing to get clear. What God begets is God. What God creates is not God. just as what a man makes is not a man. That is why men are not sons of God in the sense that Christ is. They may be like God in certain ways, but they are not things of the same kind. They are more like statues or pictures. Now, in terms of the Trinity, the language, again, we're struggling trying to find language and saying the relationship between the Father and the Son is one of begetting. We're using that term to say that they're one of the same essence. But this begetting isn't in a point of time. The Son is eternally begotten. There's never a time in which the Son was not. But it's just a word to try to get at a reality, a truth that's very difficult for us to understand. In another chapter, he begins to give an illustration using books of how these two can be eternally together, eternally in a relationship like that. But right now, the point is he's using this notion of begetting to get at this, and he's tying back to the early creeds. He says, a statue has the shape of a man, but it is not alive. In the same way, man has, in a sense, as I'm going to explain, the shape or likeness of God, but he has not got the kind of life God has. Now, in this series, he's going to go on and show, but through the incarnation, through God becoming a human being, has enabled God to actually give us that life, his life, by becoming one with us, imparting that life into us. And if I can take liberties here, 2 Peter 1:4, as a result, we have become partakers of the divine nature. There's a sense in which when God and humans came together in Christ, it set a new paradigm for a new humanity. A humanity that actually shares in the life of the Son. And it talks about us then in this new birth as being begotten of the Spirit, not made simply. He finishes this one, he says, that is precisely what Christianity is about. The world is a great sculptor shop. We are the statues, and there is a rumor going around the shop that some of us are someday going to come to life. So we start with statues, sculptures, but it's as if the sculptor is able to actually breathe into this one and have them come alive. If you're familiar with G.K. Chesterton, I really encourage you to get his play, The Surprise. He dramatizes this in a very, very remarkable way, this notion of coming alive.